G'day, Ben here. I hope you've been doing really well. I've been getting some really good feedback about my Focus Friday newsletter, and I thought it'd be a good idea to also do a video with each of the tips that I've been sending out via email. Now, of course, you can sign up for those tips if you want. All you got to do is go to my website, which is on3legs.com, and download the checklist that you'll see on the homepage, or anything really. Just opt in for something and you'll end up on my email list, and then you'll get the Focus Friday emails. But if you don't get those emails and you're here on the, wherever I've got this video posted, you should see it being posted here each week. Now this week, I'm going to share some insights about one of the key elements in photography, and that is aperture. Now, understanding aperture can significantly, and I mean significantly, enhance the quality of your images, but also help you achieve whatever desired effect you want more consistently, because you'll understand how it affects the end result. Now, aperture refers to the opening inside the camera lens through where the light comes in. And you might have, if you've ever held your lens up to the light and you dial your aperture, if you've got an older style lens, you'll be able to see that opening and closing, a bit like the pupil of your eye. Now, in a camera lens, it's actually measured in what's called f-stops. So things like f2.8, f4, f8, and so on. You've probably heard that before. Now, the lower or smaller the number, it actually means it's a larger opening in your lens, whilst the higher the f-stop number means a smaller opening. Now, this can be a little bit confusing, but it's just the way it is, because it's actually, the number represents a fraction of the diameter of the front of the lens element, or the lens element itself. So how does aperture affect your photos? Well, firstly, let's talk a bit about depth of field, because depth of field is that range of distance within a photo that appears sharp. So you might see photos sometimes where the background is blurry and the foreground is sharp, or you might see photos where the whole image is sharp. And where the background is blurry, that's considered a shallow depth of field, and where the background and the front and it's sharp throughout is called a deep depth of field, right? So just understanding that. Now, there are actually 4 elements that affect the depth of field in your images. One of them is focal length. One is the distance between you and your subject. One is the sensor size in your camera, and the other one is aperture. Now, today we're going to be talking about aperture, and so it's good to understand how aperture affects your depth of field, because you can use this creatively when it comes to your photography. Now, a larger aperture, which is, remember, that lower f-stop number, so maybe f2.8 or 1.4 or 1.2, depending what your lens goes to. It might only go to 3.5 or something like that. That's okay. But that lower f-stop creates what's called a shallower depth of field. Now, this results in a blurred background. Sometimes you might have heard it referred to as bokeh or bokeh. And what this does is leave you with a sharp subject. Now, this is ideal for portraits, macro photography, and this effect is great for isolating your subject. So you've probably seen this. I mean, just look at a magazine, or look at any portrait photography, and this is pretty common, because the background is not as important as what the foreground is or the subject is. And so this is a technique they use to isolate the subject and make sure that they're standing out against any busy background, right? Especially if it's in a city or something like that. Now, on the other hand, if you use a smaller aperture, which is once again a higher f-stop number, so remember the high number is a small opening in the lens, that's going to increase the depth of field, which gives you more of the scene in focus. Now, this is great for things like landscape photography, architectural photography. Can also be useful in macro photography, because when you're so close to your subject, remember I said that's one of the elements that affects your depth of field, you might need to have a higher f-stop, which is a smaller opening. But let's just focus on aperture for now, because I think it's important. But if you're doing landscapes or architectural photography, typically you want a higher f number, which will give you a greater depth of field. Now, the other thing that we need to consider is how aperture affects our overall exposure, because remember we said that it represents the amount of light that's coming into the lens. So a larger aperture allows more light to enter the lens. Remember, a large aperture is a small number, like a f2.8 or 4 or something like that. Providing that all of your other settings remain the same, and you change to that larger aperture, which is the smaller f-stop number, it will make your photo brighter. Now, this is really useful in low light conditions, And you might see people with lenses that are 1.2 or something like that. And, you know, if you look at people who photograph things like bands that are playing live on stage, they'll use these lenses that have very low f numbers, and they call this fast glass. Okay, so fast glass, and very useful in low light conditions. Now, of course, this means that a smaller aperture, which is that higher f-stop number, will create the opposite effect, as it reduces the amount of light coming into your lens, and this will help you avoid overexposure in really bright conditions. And it's the same reason why some filters are made that go in front of your lens to reduce the light, because there are times when you don't want as much light coming in to get the right exposure. Now, there is another thing to think about, and that is the sharpness of your images and lens performance. And if you go to either extreme f-stop, whether it's a very small f number or a very high f number, you'll actually get some side effects, which we won't talk about in this video, but you'll get some side effects within your images. So most lenses have what we call a sweet spot aperture, and typically I find that somewhere between f8 and f11 depending on the lens, and that's where they will sort of perform optimally in terms of sharpness. And you're going to have to test your own lens to see where its sweet spot is, and the only way to do it is to lock your camera off on a tripod and shoot a series of photos from the widest aperture all the way up to the narrowest aperture, and then have a look at your images on a computer screen at 100%. And you'll start to see things like, for example, softness on the edges of your image. You might see what's called diffraction. You might see things like purple fringing, which is chromatic aberration, all sorts of different side effects that you get from changing aperture. So it's a good idea to have a look. Now, what I want to do with these videos is make sure that you have some practical tips to go away with and use, so you can put all of this into practice. So I want you to give it a go. I want you to find a subject. It could be a person or anything, really, doesn't really matter. I want you to get within a few meters, so nice and close, and make sure that the background behind the subject is at least, let's say, 20 meters behind, and get a nice sharp focus on that subject that is in the foreground. Use the lowest f number you can with the lens that you have. Like I said, every lens is a bit different, so just go to the lowest one that you can, and then take a photo. And you'll see that the background will be blurry. This is great for portraits. It's going to make whatever that subject is stand out, because it'll be nice and sharp beautifully against a blurred background. Now, once you've done that, I want you to try a high f number, which is going to give you that smaller aperture, so it's going to let less light in. Something like f11 through to maybe f16, and then you're going to see that when you take that image, that everything from the foreground through to the background is more likely to be in focus or be sharper, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So, I want you to go out, experiment with different apertures to see how they affect your photos, and that way, you can develop a better understanding how to use these creatively, because that's really the key, is to understand how these things will creatively impact your final image. Now, on a final note, just leave a comment if you've got any questions, or even if you just found it helpful. I'd love to hear from you. And that's pretty much it. Now, all you got to do is get out there and take some photos. See ya.